Imagine a world where Western civilization as we know it has collapsed. Governments have finally fallen after decades of climate-induced environmental disasters. And it's everybody for themselves. We're back to the Stone Age, and there are no global institutions to pull us out of the mess we've made from climate change. While this may sound far-fetched, there's a community of people who believe that this is a real possibility. And not only that it's a possibility, but that it's inevitable. Climate doomers. Now today, I want to talk about this, climate doomerism. Specifically, I want to look at a bit of science and history to see if we can determine the validity of these claims and whether or not the science is correct and whether or not it is inevitable society will collapse. And if so, what we can do about it. My name is Jack Osmond, and today we're talking about climate doomerism. Climate doomerism is ultimately based on the claim that climate change is too far gone for us to stop. Now, where do they get this information from? Because we know that the IPCC, the world's trusted authority on climate change, says that we've got plenty of time, well, if not plenty of time, at least a few years, to reverse our carbon emissions. Well, part of this comes from the idea that the IPCC has been traditionally conservative in their estimates. In one study by Bryce et al., they argue that there is a directional bias towards what they call erring on the side of least drama. The idea here is that climate scientists are downplaying how bad climate change really is in order to give the public a false sense of security. For example, to look at some scientific figures here, in 2001, the IPCC predicted that the sea level would rise by 2.2 millimeters a year. However, between 1993 and 2005, the actual sea level rise was closer to 3.3 millimeters a year, which is an underestimate by the IPCC of over 50%. In addition, Bryce et al. Say, quote, important impacts are proceeding faster than expected, including CO2 emissions, increased rainfall in already rainy areas, continental ice sheet melting, Arctic sea ice decline, and sea level rise. And then this was a faster increase than expected by the 2009 Copenhagen diagnosis, also published by the IPCC. Now, in one paper very popular in sort of collapse circles, called Deep Adaptation, Jem Bendel from the University of Cumbria argues that we're going to face inevitable collapse, probable catastrophe, and possible extinction. And the science he's using to back this up is actually pretty compelling. He was writing the paper in 2018, and as of 2018, 17 of the 18 warmest years on record had occurred since 2001. In addition, data collected since 2014 had shown nonlinear changes in the environment. Essentially, these things like rainfall, carbon emissions, CO2 rise, temperature were all increasing non-linearly. So instead of going up like this, it's going up like this, which I don't know much about math, but I know that's not very good. In addition, a lot of this climate doomer science is based on Arctic sea ice melting. If you think of a cup of water, you know that when you have ice in it, it stays cool, but once the ice melts, it gets quite hot. The idea here is that when the Arctic sea ice melts, global warming will increase catastrophically. According to Peter Wadhams, an ice-free Arctic summer is well within our future and will in fact occur soon, which would double warming due to CO2. In addition, these observed temperatures in the Arctic are greater than the climate models predicted, as said before. Furthermore, if we're looking at agriculture, which we know is something that's going to be directly related to society's ability to thrive, we've already seen crop yields decrease by 1 to 2% in the past century, which costs billions of dollars. And in addition, we see rapidly increasing ocean acidification, which is killing fish, which large portions of the population depend on for food. So this is what's already happened, which it seems pretty bad, but you know, maybe we still have a chance to avert it. Now, according to Jem Bendel, that is not the case. So we have this idea that there is a 2-degree figure that we need to avoid. And if we don't avoid that, it will cause dangerous and uncontrollable levels of climate change. And now the following is a quote from Bendel himself. The politically permissible scientific consensus is that we need to stay beneath 2 degrees warming of global ambient temperatures to avoid dangerous and uncontrollable levels of climate change, with impacts such as mass starvation, disease, flooding, storm destruction, forced migration, and war. That figure was agreed by governments that were dealing with many domestic and international pressures from vested interests, particularly corporations. It is therefore not a figure that many scientists would advise, given that the many ecosystems will be lost and many risks created if we approach 2 degrees global ambient warming. So we'll see problems if we reach that. And in fact, there's some science that will show that we're already going to get past it. An NBC article released a couple years back showed that baked-in climate change is already going to get us past 2 degrees, up to 2.3 degrees Celsius. According to figures that Bendel cites, our locked-into climate change figure is going to look more like 5 degrees Celsius, which would be absolutely catastrophic. Now, a lot of this has to do with Arctic sea ice and permafrost, which is one of the most catastrophic situations. Now, the jury is still out on this one, the permafrost, but essentially how this works is that there is permanent frost in the Arctic at the bottoms of the oceans, which house a lot of methane. Now, methane is 80% more impactful for global warming than CO2 is. Now, essentially what could happen is, as the Arctic heats up and as the oceans heat up, this frost could melt, releasing massive amounts of methane into the atmosphere, which could cause rapid warming. In addition, according to Bendel, even if we were to stop all carbon emissions tomorrow, in order to remove all of the carbon that is currently in the atmosphere, we would need to scale up our carbon removal technology by a factor of 2 million times within 2 years. And it would all need to be powered by renewables. Just to give us sort of an example of this, from the Arctic ice melting, change caused by melting is equivalent to 25% of the direct forcing of temperature increase from CO2 in the past 30 years, effectively meaning that if we cut emissions by 25%, we would only undo the sea ice melting. So if we're looking at this, it seems like rapid climate change is here. Bendel tells us that we're not sure what the future may be, but we can make predictions, and his prediction is as follows. We do not know for certain how disruptive the impacts of climate change will be, or where we'll be most affected, especially as economic and social systems will respond in complex ways. But the evidence is mounting that the impacts will be catastrophic to our livelihoods and the societies that we live within. Our norms of behavior, what we call our civilization, may also degrade. While when we contemplate this possibility, it can seem abstract. The words I ended the previous paragraph with may seem, subconsciously at least, to be describing a situation to feel sorry about as we witness scenes on TV or online. But when I say starvation, destruction, migration, disease, and war, I mean in your own life. With the power down, soon you wouldn't have water coming out of your tap. You'll depend on your neighbors for food and some warmth. You'll become malnourished. You won't know whether to stay or go. You will fear being violently killed before starving to death. Bendel draws a pretty clear picture for us of what the future is going to look like based on his predictions. Another person prominent in the climate doomer field is Michael Dowd, an eco-theologian whose YouTube channel, The Great Story, has a plethora of videos about our coming collapse, which he, in fact, is quite certain of. Michael Dowd starts one of his most popular videos off telling us that anywhere above 380 parts per million of CO2 in the atmosphere would render it impossible for complex civilizations to exist. In addition, he says that past 4 degrees Celsius, the human species Homo sapiens will cease to exist. He tells us that there's no evidence that humans can survive past 4 degrees or that civilization can exist past 2 degrees. He's telling us that we are in abrupt, runaway, irreversible climate change. And looking at historical data, which I will be posting on the screen, he shows us that there is no way humans can survive in this environment which is going to be created by climate change. In addition, he tells us that in order to survive this relatively short period of major warming and destabilization, we will have to return to indigenous, eco-theo, and animist worldviews. Essentially, he's making an argument from necessity. Because this is how societies existed for thousands of years without collapsing, this is what we're going to need to do in the future. He shows us what he calls the carbon pulse, which shows the time in which civilization is using fossil fuels, and how it's just going to look like a big spike on a graph, and then we're going to go back to the Stone Age, back to muscle and firewood, as he puts it. Now, to his credit, he is right that, quote, for 50 years, 33 conferences and half a dozen major international agreements have not reduced atmospheric carbon concentrations one bit. But what I would like to point out is that his argument does have a severe logical fallacy. He's making an appeal to ignorance fallacy. He's saying that because we haven't seen humans survive in the past in these temperatures, and we don't have evidence that they can survive in higher temperatures, they therefore won't. When in fact, just because we don't have evidence that it's not true, doesn't mean that it's necessarily untrue. Recently I watched a DW report on Ben Knight, a man who has founded what he calls the Barracks in Germany, where he is preparing for the apocalypse, trying to create a fully self-sustaining barracks, because he believes that collapse is, in fact, inevitable. And in fact, in this clip, he talks about how he doesn't even know what he would do otherwise because he's so certain about the catastrophe coming.
I asked Ben how he would feel if collapse, as he sees it, is averted.
I mean, I'm not going to feel that I've entirely wasted my life. I'm also not going to feel that I contributed particularly to it. It's not, yay, the barracks saved the world. Definitely not that. I don't know, really. Don't know what I'll do.
In addition, I'd like to look a little bit at Reddit, because I think Reddit gives us a great insight into the zeitgeist of the doomer and collapse community. Now on r/collapse, we can see a couple memes. First of all, we have millennials poking the housing crisis, saying, come on, collapse. In addition, we have my newest art piece based on the IPCC report. I call this one Summer 2030. That's pretty insane. We see a guy in a hazmat suit grilling. Maybe this is the 4th of July, while literally all of civilization is on fire in the background. I think that's a pretty funny image there, because Americans will continue to eat their hamburgers no matter what's happening. But perhaps it's a little exaggerated. And finally, we have a repost of a tweet that says, stop being depressed about the past. You can't change it. Start being depressed about the future, because you can't change that either. So, it kind of seems like these people want the world to collapse. They're waiting for it, and they're expecting it to be violent and bloody, and to send us straight back into the Stone Age. And we'll see a total collapse of civilization and society. I do want to give a little bit of credit to these people, because often what they're criticizing is a sort of blind pessimism that is prevalent among much of the American population, which is, we as a species and as a society have gone through crises before. We've gone through the population crises in the 80s, the Cold War, World War II, the stock market crash, all of these things that seemed like it would collapse civilization, but in fact we survived, humans found a way. And there is a good point here that this is just a narrative of inaction. If you're telling yourself this, you're putting a responsibility on some abstract notion of the species to solve the problems and society to solve the problem. When in reality, I think there is a point to be made that if we're not doing something about climate change, we are going to see massive disruptions. However, what I see is a sort of blind pessimism here. While the science is not promising, and it does seem like there are going to be massive environmental impacts of climate change that our societies will have to respond to, I don't think that a collapse would be something that sends us straight back into the Stone Age, or has us grilling in the middle of a lava pool. I think these are a little bit absurd. And I think often, as Bendel himself points out, people prefer horrible certainties to uncertainties. Perhaps that's just the human psyche. Now, in order to explore what such dramatic climactic shifts could mean for our society, and to investigate these narratives of collapse a little bit further, I want to turn to a bit of collapse studies. Somebody that Michael Dowd talks a lot about in his videos is Joseph Tainter, who in 1988 published the book The Collapse of Complex Societies, which now serves as a sort of touchstone in collapse studies. In this book, Joseph Tainter describes collapse as a loss in a level of complexity. So, if we think about our global society, it is global. It is precisely that. And how that functions is institutions are linked by markets and by international agreements in order to become global. If we were to see a loss of complexity, perhaps that would mean that countries are now operating only on a continental or national scale because of some crisis that has crippled these international institutions, causing them to collapse. This would be a collapse. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that all of society ceases to exist and we're back in the Stone Age. It just means that our civilization, as we know it, perhaps would undergo some changes. Now, in the book Reimagining Collapse, Kidder et al. Argue that collapse should be focused more on adaptation and reorganization. One example is a case study of the Han Dynasty, which collapsed in 220 CE. Essentially what ended up happening was that changes in climate caused increasingly arid farmland, anthropogenic modifications to the Yellow River caused more flooding, and overconsumption of resources, particularly agricultural resources, led the society without as much food and resources to manage environmental crises. And this quote explains this a bit further. The effects of deforestation for iron smelting were amplified by large-scale anthropogenic modifications to the environment from agricultural intensification, resource consumption for a growing population, and widespread interventions in the natural world, such as the construction of canals, irrigation facilities, reservoirs, and especially levees and dikes to constrain the Yellow River and its tributaries. These activities led to a greater erosion and increased aggradation within the Yellow River channel, which enlarged and compounded the effects of environmental disasters. This sounds awfully similar to our own society. As we continuously modify the environment, it's causing more and more environmental catastrophes. Eventually, a series of catastrophes made it impossible for the Han Dynasty to respond, and the population rose up, causing the dynasty to collapse. In addition, a lot of the royal families now saw the government as incompetent, and their monopoly on power was lost. Following this, the Eastern Han took power with the help of the royal families, reassuming governance of China, of Chinese civilization. However, eventually, they were collapsed until later another dynasty took its place. Now, what the authors want to emphasize here is that Chinese civilization existed throughout this period of crisis, throughout these wars, these uprisings, and these environmental catastrophes that fundamentally affected the Chinese civilization. But now we know today that China is one of the strongest civilizations that exist on our planet, and they've been around for over 5,000 years. So while they faced all of these crises, they still exist. We can see that collapse is relative to both the government and time period that we're talking about. So it may seem very easy to look at our current world through this sort of end of history lens, of this is the height of civilization, and we've achieved all there is to achieve. But in reality, we are just in another stage of transition. In fact, I think we can think of it very similarly to the Roman Empire, which had essentially established a world order controlling much of Europe, parts of Asia, and Africa. When they collapsed, it wasn't that everybody was sent back into the Stone Age, it was that there were new governments and new institutions that were created to respond to the problems left by the Roman Empire. So perhaps if we're looking at this a little differently, a collapse isn't total apocalypse, but rather a sometimes violent, sometimes bloody, and often unstable period of transition when a society can no longer respond to the problems it is confronted with. What would this look like in the United States? Well, it's hard to tell. We have a rather young civilization, which is, I think, part of what fuels this sort of doomerism, is that we kind of think of ourselves as the pinnacle of Western civilization, a polity that will never collapse. But if we look at history, everybody thinks that their society isn't going to collapse. Everybody thinks it's not going to happen to me. It seems to be a human impulse. But a rather recent natural disaster in United States history can shed a lot of light on our current predicament. After Hurricane Katrina, we know that FEMA was notoriously slow in their response, and that there was a lot of violence and unrest in New Orleans following the disaster. However, that violence didn't need to happen. In Rebecca Solnit's book, A Paradise Built in Hell, she investigates how the media and government perpetuated narratives of violence, which actually propagated violence itself. In fact, the survivors of the disaster were working together and living peacefully, and when the United States government believed there was violence, and many citizens who were armed believed there was violence, they actually went out and perpetuated violence in the city following the disaster. To quote Solnit, much of what happened after the levees broke didn't have to. It was the result of fear. When Tierney was speaking about elite panic, fear of social disorder, fear of poor, minorities, and immigrants, obsession with looting and property crime, willingness to resort to deadly force, and actions taken on the basis of rumor, she was talking shortly after Katrina, perhaps one of the worst cases of elite panic in the United States history. New Orleans had long been a high-crime city, but the mythic city of monsters the media and authorities invented in the wake of Katrina never existed, except in their imagination. During the hurricane, there were reports on television from the Oprah show to CNN about those sheltered in the Superdome, the survivors, where there were apparently hundreds of gang members, dead bodies, and hooligans killing, raping people. Somebody went and said this on the Oprah show. In response to reports of looting, the state government took emergency responders off of helping those in crisis, telling them to instead focus on combating looting. In reality, what was happening? Well, people were requisitioning. They were breaking into the supermarkets to get food, to get water. And actually what happened is that young men were often going into these places in order to get resources for the elderly, ill, and young survivors. These people were not looting, but in fact they were providing for their community in the only way possible during this crisis. And what happened is that these resources were distributed equitably among the people of the Superdome. When FEMA eventually did send aid, one police officer described the scene where the helicopters were dropping down the resources, the food and the water. Quote, "There was a group of people, good Samaritans, who pilfered the convention center for hand carts and walked out to where the food and water was and brought it back to the people. And the people got together as a group and disseminated it amongst themselves without any riots, fights, or anything." So what actually happened is that the situation was quite peaceful. People were working together as a community. There were people going out on their own boats, rescuing people from the roofs when the National Guard was taken off that to combat looting. And when the violence did come, it was from the government, who was working against this all-encompassing term of looting. And it was vigilante gun owners who, after hearing reports of, quote, gang rapes and wanton murders, end quote, went out to do what they saw as protecting the community, which often included perpetuating racist violence. So we see that when the survivors' first instinct was to work together, even without any social organization keeping them doing so, those trying to protect the institutions of property, the state, and racism were the ones perpetuating violence. Now this runs contrary to our notion of the state of nature, which we inherit from Thomas Hobbes, where we're all violent and out for ourselves, but it's institutions that protect us. Perhaps it's the other way around. The institutions that we're living in are making us violent, and without the shackles of a capitalist society, we're able to engage in community action and respond to crises in an equitable way. Going back to Kidder and reframing collapse, transformations in civilizations and institutions are perpetuated by agents making explicit choices. Institutions are not abstract free entities, but the sum of decisions made by agents. And to the extent that they behave badly, it is because people in the institutions are behaving badly. How people in institutions behave and believe are going to affect what happens after crises. If we think that people are going to become violent, self-interested gang members who are killing people in the streets, then we're going to send out more violent authority to try and stop these crises, which is only going to compound the violence, which is only going to play into these narratives that society is going to end. We see that even in times with no resources and no governmental structures, people can still come together. The aftermath of Katrina shows us that the coming environmental and social crises may not necessarily be violent, but they will be if we expect violence and perpetuate these attitudes. So to sum up, we've looked at a little bit of the science, and we've shown that perhaps there is destructive climate change coming. But we've also looked at some history and realized that collapse isn't an all-or-nothing process. It's not that we have civilization one day and anarchy the other. We see that how existing institutions respond to issues and how new institutions will be created is based heavily on the opinions and beliefs of the people in power, in addition to just the regular people themselves. So climate change may indeed upend our modern conception of civilization, but if we go into this crisis pessimistically, expecting the worst, if we maintain a fatalist, defeatist, doomer attitude, we will be one of the causes of our society's collapse. But if we look at this period of crisis as an opportunity for reformation, as horrible as it may be, to reconstruct the institutions that have caused this crisis and create a more just and equitable society, we may just find the will we need to make a better world. I want to end this video with a quote from Antonio Gramsci, an Italian revolutionary Marxist who was in jail for most of his life. One of the quotes that he tells us about how we should be making change is that we need to have pessimism of the intellect, but optimism of the will. You must realize that I am far from being beaten. It seems to me that a man ought to be deeply convinced that the source of his own moral force is in himself. His very energy and will, the coherence of his ends and means, that he never falls into those vulgar, banal moods, pessimism and optimism. My own state of mind synthesizes these two feelings and transcends them. My mind is pessimistic, but my will is optimistic. Whatever the situation, I imagine the worst that could happen in order to summon up all of my reserves and willpower to overcome every obstacle.